Like the rest of Western Europe, Roman Hispania was deeply affected by the barbarian invasions. However, the passage of the Vandals and the settlement of the Suebi and then the Visigoths did not cause a true break with the Roman past. These invaders, who deeply respected the culture, language, and institutions of the empire, ensured the survival of the Roman world for several centuries. So much so that the Visigothic Kingdom was long considered the most illustrious of the barbarian kingdoms. Vae Victis, a casus belli production. Integrated into the Roman world since the early 2nd century BC, the peninsula gained a political identity with Diocletian's reform in 297, which grouped the provinces of Baetica, Lusitania, Carthaginensis, Galicia, and Tarraconensis into the Diocesis Hispaniarum. The vicarius, who governed the region from Merida, was primarily responsible for tax collection, but also served as a judge. Christianity, which spread gradually across the peninsula from the 2nd century, established itself within the existing territorial divisions, and the provincial capitals quickly became religious centers. Now, elevated to the status of a diocese, Hispania was no longer the flourishing province it had been during the first 2 centuries AD. The turmoil and crises that struck the peninsula from the 3rd century, beginning with an invasion by the Moors from North Africa in 171 to 178, led to a near autarky. The local oligarchies, though still ruling in the name of the emperor, gradually gained a degree of independence. With the Roman army occupied along the limes, or engaged in the various civil wars shaking the empire, many of its functions were delegated to local militias. Members of the high civil, military, and ecclesiastical administration maintained Roman traditions in the cities. Meanwhile, the curiales, members of the urban oligarchies dominating local councils, were burdened with increasingly heavy administrative duties, leading to a certain degree of urban exodus. These potentiores chose instead to reside in their villa, large estates comprising land, agricultural buildings, and sometimes private churches. Once worked primarily by slaves, these lands were increasingly cultivated by free peasants and colony, who exchanged part of their harvest for the right to farm a plot of land. By the late 4th century, in the northern and western regions, these villas, often adorned with mosaics, had become self-sufficient entities, whose free and servile workforce could, when necessary, serve as a private army. The relative peace that the Iberian Peninsula seemed to enjoy in the 4th century was abruptly interrupted in 407 by the uprising of the usurper Flavius Constantine in Britain. His rebellion quickly spread to Gaul and Spain the following year. The ensuing civil war, as rival factions vied for control of the imperial throne, significantly weakened the Roman forces, leaving them unable to prevent the Vandals, Suebi, and Alans from crossing the western Pyrenees and invading northern Hispania. This marked the end of 5 centuries of exclusive Roman rule. The sudden arrival of these barbarian peoples, Germans such as the Vandals and Suebi, as well as the Alans of Central Asian origin, coincided with a major plague outbreak, ushering in a period of crisis that would last for over a century and a half, only ending when the Visigoths ultimately established control over the entirety of Spain. The 2 years following the barbarian incursion into Hispania, were described as years of war, massacres, plagues, epidemics, famines, and pillaging, with the northern and western region of the peninsula, which were less urbanized, suffering the most. Around 411, the invaders reached an agreement among themselves, dividing their spheres of influence and exploitation. The Hasding Vandals and the Suebi settled in Galatia, the Alans in Lusitania and western Carthaginensis, and the Sailing Vandals in Baetica, while Tarraconensis remained under Roman control. However, new arrivals soon made their appearance. In 412, 2 years after sacking Rome, the Visigoths under King Ataulf entered Gaul and founded the Kingdom of Toulouse. Originally from Scandinavia, these Germans had migrated to the mouth of the Vistula in the 2nd century, before moving to the Black Sea in the early 3rd century. There, in 332, they were granted feudality status by the Romans. However, in 376, under pressure from the Huns, they crossed the Danube into Roman territory. Settling in Thrace, they soon rebelled against the Romans, decisively defeating them at the Battle of Adrianople in 378. They then turned to plundering, first in Illyria, then in Italy, before reaching Gaul. Converted to Christianity as early as 340, they distanced themselves from the pagan barbarians, but later adopted Arianism, which had been condemned by the Council of Nicaea. As a result, they were regarded as heretics by the Romans, who saw them as the ultimate barbarians. Despite the fact that, over centuries of contact with Rome, they had become largely Romanized. After the death of King Ataulf in 415, his successor, Wallia, was tasked by the Romans with fighting the other barbarian groups in Hispania. The Visigoths waged a devastating campaign, and within a few years, both the Alans and the Sailing Vandals were completely annihilated. However, the Visigoths temporarily withdrew from Iberian affairs after the Romans granted them control over Aquitaine. In 419, a war broke out between the Hasding Vandals and the Suebi, prompting a Roman intervention in favor of the Suebi. The Vandals, forced southward, settled in parts of Baetica and Carthaginensis, leaving their name to the region that would later be known as Andalusia. In the following years, the Vandals seized and pillaged the Balearic Islands, captured Seville, and ultimately decided to cross the Mediterranean in 429. A total of 80,000 Germans migrated to North Africa, where they would establish their own kingdom. Ultimately, 20 years after crossing the Pyrenees, the only barbarian group remaining in the peninsula were the Suebi, who had settled in the northwest between the Minho and the Duero. The rest of Hispania was once again under Roman control. Let us now take a closer look at the Suebi, a little-known Germanic people. The Suebi who settled in Galicia were relatively few in number, numbering between 30,000 and 40,000. They primarily controlled the regions of Braga and Porto, while the rest of the province remained under the authority of the Galaico-Roman aristocracy. There are few historical sources detailing relations between the Suebi and the indigenous population, but it seems that, initially, these relations were rather peaceful. Both groups had a common interest in resisting the Vandals, who were settled further south. However, once the Vandals departed, the Suebi began launching raiding expeditions into southern Galicia. Merida was conquered in 440, followed by Seville the following year, and much of the western provinces fell under Suebi control despite Roman attempts to stop their advance. The Visigothic king, Theodoric II, based in Toulouse, launched a punitive expedition against the Suebi, crushing them at the Battle of the Orbigo River in 456. He had their king executed before returning to Aquitaine, not without first plundering and devastating the regions of Astorga and Palencia on his way back. During the first half of the 5th century, the Suebi rapidly merged with the local population, which came to identify with them. The lack of Roman urbanization in much of the province, along with the weakness of an economy largely based on gathering and extensive agriculture, may explain the limited resistance from the still semi-nomadic local populations. Furthermore, the raiding expeditions organized by the Suebi brought additional resources to the Galicians, which likely contributed to their acceptance of the Germanic newcomers. As we have seen, the Visigoths of Theodoric II, at this time based in Toulouse, regularly conducted incursions south of the Pyrenees, either at the request of the Romans or on their own initiative. Following the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476, Euric, Theodoric's successor, invaded Tarraconensis and placed it under Visigothic rule. Apart from resistance from the local aristocracy, the population offered little opposition. The Visigothic king continued to reside in Toulouse, and those Visigoths who settled in Hispania were granted lands either from the imperial treasury or confiscated from great families that had opposed them. The Germanic rulers did not exclude the local oligarchies from power, which facilitated their acceptance by the Hispano-Roman population. Under the reign of Alaric II, the Visigoths faced their powerful northern neighbors, the Franks of Clovis. Newly converted to Catholicism, Clovis enjoyed the support of the clergy, and his military successes against the Visigoths led some of them to migrate across the Pyrenees, mainly to the northern part of the peninsula. Gradually, the center of power shifted from the Mediterranean coast to Toledo, in the heart of Hispania. The year 507 would prove decisive for both Germanic peoples, as well as for the future of Western Europe. At the beginning of the 6th century, Europe was undergoing profound transformations. The Franks, led by King Clovis, sought to expand their territory and consolidate their power in Gaul. Their main obstacle, the Visigoths, under King Alaric II, who ruled over a vast region stretching from southern Gaul to the Iberian Peninsula. In the spring of 507, Clovis and his eldest son, Theuderic, gathered a formidable army. Their objective was clear: to cross the Loire and march toward Poitiers, the heart of the Visigothic Kingdom. Alaric II, aware of the looming threat, mobilized his troops and advanced northward to try and halt the invasion. However, he faced a major problem. Part of his army was absent, engaged in defending the Iberian Peninsula against the Eastern Romans. Moreover, his Ostrogothic allies, led by Theodoric, did not join him, leaving Alaric in a precarious situation. Despite these difficulties, Alaric had no choice but to confront Clovis. The two armies met on the vast plains of Vouille, near Poitiers. At dawn on the decisive day, the Visigoths launched their attack. Their cavalry, accustomed to successive charges, attempted to break through the Frankish lines. But the Franks, true to their reputation as formidable warriors, formed an impenetrable wall of Francisque, those deadly throwing axes that wreaked havoc among the enemy ranks. The battle quickly turned into brutal hand-to-hand combat, where both sides fought fiercely for supremacy. Then came one of the most pivotal moments of the battle. Clovis, known for his courage on the battlefield, is said to have personally confronted Alaric II. According to some chronicles, Clovis himself struck down the Visigothic king, boldly charging at him in the midst of the melee. While history may have embellished the event, it aligns with the contemporary image of Clovis, a fearsome and audacious leader, much like his father. Alaric's death marked a decisive turning point. Demoralized by the loss of their king, the Visigoths began to fall into disarray. But it was the intervention of the Taifal cavalry, an elite Frankish unit, that sealed the battle's outcome. Their charge shattered the Visigothic cavalry, leading to a full-scale rout. As in the Battle of Tolbiac against the Alemanni, the death of the enemy king triggered a general flight. The Visigoths retreated southward, carrying with them Amalaric, the heir to the throne. By mid-morning, the battle was over. Clovis had triumphed. This victory opened the path southward. Now, nothing stood in the way of his conquest of Visigothic lands. He seized Burdigala, modern-day Bordeaux, and the following year, in 508, he captured Tolosa, the Visigothic capital. Though Narbonensis temporarily escaped his grasp, later reclaimed by the Ostrogoths, Clovis secured control over Gascony, Aquitaine, and even Auvergne, cementing his dominance over Gaul. This battle was more than just a military victory. It had lasting consequences for the Frankish kingdom. Clovis began to establish what would later become the southern borders of France. The Merovingians, followed by the Carolingians and Capetians, would inherit these strategic territories. As early as 508, Clovis relocated his capital to Paris, abandoning Tournai, which had become too peripheral given his new conquests. Thus, the Battle of Vouillé was not just a military triumph. It marked the emergence of a new power in Western Europe, the Franks, and the beginning of the formation of France's future borders. For the Visigoths, this defeat at the hands of the Franks is often considered the birth of the Visigothic Kingdom of Spain. However, despite now ruling only the Iberian Peninsula and Septimania, they remained under the influence of the Ostrogoths, ruled by King Theodoric II of Italy for several decades. As conflicts between the Ostrogoths and Byzantines escalated, the Italian Goths gradually withdrew from Iberian affairs. By 549, a noble of mixed Visigothic and Hispano-Roman aristocratic lineage, Aguila, was elected king in Merida. Aguila sought to subjugate the semi-autonomous cities of Baetica, whose independence had been reinforced by recent turmoil. His military campaign against Cordoba, however, ended in failure. In 551, another Visigothic noble, Athanagild, rebelled in Seville. Seizing this opportunity, Justinian, the Byzantine emperor, dispatched an imperial army to Spain. The Byzantines occupied the southeastern coast of the peninsula, from Denia to Cadiz, until 624, securing control over the Strait of Gibraltar. The Byzantine threat ultimately led to Aguila's assassination by his own followers, who then rallied behind Athanagild. Once in power, Athanagild pursued a centralizing policy. He abandoned Merida, which had supported Aguila, and distanced himself from the rebellious cities of Baetica, choosing Toledo as the new capital of the kingdom. After several failed attempts to expel the Byzantines from Cartagena and Malaga, he sought alliances with the Franks, marrying his daughters Brunhilda and Galswintha to the Frankish kings Sigebert of Austrasia and Chilperic of Neustria. Upon his death, in 567, Athonagild left behind a kingdom without a male heir. 5 months later, the Visigothic aristocracy of Septimania elected Duke Liuva as king. However, his election was met with resistance from the Toledan faction, which supported Athonagild's widow, Galswinta. A compromise was reached. Liuva associated his brother, Leovigild, with his reign, who then married Galswinta to solidify his legitimacy. While Liuva mainly ruled the northern territories, he remained co-sovereign of Hispania until his death in 573. Leovigild's rise to sole power marked a crucial turning point in Visigothic history in Iberia, signaling the end of their long period of settlement. Now firmly established, the Visigoths had gradually taken control of territories abandoned by Roman administrators and sparsely populated regions. By collaborating with the Catholic population and preserving Roman infrastructure, they would go on to dominate Iberian history for the next century and a half. Thank you for watching. If you liked my content, like, share and post a comment. See you soon for the next episode.